Greetings and peace, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. Today, I have the honor and privilege of being joined by Brother Matt Douglas. And if you have not watched parts 1 and 2, please watch those before watching this. This will be part 3. And Brother Matt Douglas joins us to basically talk about the Western hegemony and interference on the Asian continent as somebody himself who has lived and worked there and has experience there as somebody who has been in the East and the West. So his experience is welcomed, his knowledge is welcomed. I know parts 1 and 2 got a good reception and people enjoyed it. So with part 3, Brother Matt Douglas will educate us on this aspect of Western interference on the Asian continent. So Nur alaikum, my brother, and thanks for coming back for part 3.
Nur alaikum, Salman. I'm glad to be back. The topic I got for today is something that can actually be kind of a standalone. So,
Yes.
Not that I don't want anybody to watch parts 1 and 2, thank you very much, but this is kind of standalone. I think it's something, it's going to actually be kind of like a, you might say an adjunct to what we've been talking about. I really want to talk about the COVID situation here, is because that's I've watched it, watched it unfold here. So, because this is, well, pretty much something everyone in the world knows about, at least, well, about COVID. And pretty much we've all known someone who's died from it too.
Mm-hmm.
And I figure it kind of like deserves its own show.
Understood.
So in just my background, well, I'm not going to get a lot into my background because, well, it's a life just like yours, and anybody else's. So one particular aspect of my background is I do have a BA in psychology, and where I went to college, and I think it's this probably applies to most Western academic psychology, is a hard-on for proving psychology is a legitimate science.
Mm-hmm.
And even if most of us probably go into psychology wanting to be counselors or of a sort, they want to make you scientists, which isn't really what you set out to do, but you learn something in the process. I'm not going to say that science is better than anything else, just that it is unique and it has to be respected as its unique discipline that it is. Including the various branches of science and how it's applied. But that is not to say that any art is not equally valid a discipline. And you can argue on some things whether they would be arts or sciences. Broadly defined, art is, I'm actually ripping off this definition from David Keirsey. Art broadly defined as any operation where the next move is a free variable rather than a fixed constant. So in that case, you might call engineering actually an art. Whereas science is a search for those constants, so that they can be applied.
Of course.
Knowledgeably. And frankly, it wasn't until I got to college, certainly at least in Western schooling, you don't really learn science in high school. You learn what other scientists have found.
Yes.
You don't learn the process of science.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it is a process. The process mainly being is in order to gain knowledge, you test, broadly defined, you test for it. But there are rules about how you do it. And one of the big ones that has to be, now there's two memes that are floating around right now that are both true and yet both kind of opposing each other. One of which is, I'm not looking at it right, I'm not going to bother looking at it and reading it verbatim on either of them. One of them that says, if you disagree with scientists, it's not a disagreement, you're just wrong. Because, basically they're scientists, they know what they're doing. And we can certainly see cases where that's true. Yeah. But the other one is, it's actually using Linus from the Peanuts gang, saying, don't say trust the science, that's anti-science, questioning science is how you do science. That's true as well. I'd probably refine that to say questioning science by studying it and coming up with questions, better questions is how you do it. You don't question science because some politician told you that this science was bad. That should be a red
Exactly.
flag. That should be a big red flag.
Mm-hmm.
When it really helped you early on, early on in the early phases of the pandemic, I was kind of able to call with 99% accuracy, if not full on, when new information comes out, whether it was going to stick or not.
Mm-hmm.
And here's what really has to be understood about science is, and more specifically about research. Okay, probably everybody's heard that something along the lines of, the real scientific articles being the peer-reviewed articles. And that's true. However, what people think is, oh, it's peer-reviewed, therefore it's the gold standard, it's a good, valid study. Well, it's kind of supposed to be that way, but very early on in your study of peer-reviewed articles, you realize that it doesn't always live up to its own standards. But what makes peer review, okay, and this does stick, is not that it's necessarily a perfect experiment, a perfect study, or anything like that. It's that in a peer-reviewed article, you are supposed to detail how you did the research to an exacting enough degree that someone, if they have the time and resources, which, well, oftentimes we don't, can replicate your study to a T. So therefore, that doesn't make the studies perfect by any stretch. Oftentimes, if it's a university professor on a budget, it's flawed. But by giving excruciating detail about how you did the research, then both yourself and others can go and pick the research apart and see how it could have been done better and question the conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
So now when it comes to something like a vaccine, now I'm not a virologist, and I do have to, when I'm reading a peer-reviewed article on that, do occasionally have to look up a biochem term. But I can still, understand what's going on, and the methodology is the same across the board in all disciplines. So you can question the research and realize, okay, wait a minute, maybe they didn't examine this here, or maybe they could have done more here. And as I said, a lot of it has flaws and obvious flaws that the researchers themselves will admit to in the discussion section of the article, and how they
Mm-hmm.
wish they could have done it better, but they were limited. Therefore, though, when it comes to something like a vaccine trial done by a big pharma company with billions of dollars, you would expect it for them to be able to fill in a lot of the gaps, so to speak.
Mm.
Sadly, that's not always done. Now, for the record, I'm also going to say here, I am fully in support of the vaccines. I'm not saying they are the only method. I'm not saying that, because, for example, Africa has had the least amount of COVID cases of any continent, well, other than Antarctica. And they get some of the lowest vaccination rate too. So they're still doing something right. And it's true that the West is being awfully arrogant and not taking a look at just what they're doing.
Thank you.
However, because of what we do know, I would still say, most people are not experts. Certainly outside of Africa, I don't think you're going to find very many people who are experts on traditional African medicine. So a vaccine is probably your best bet.
Exactly.
Get one. Now there's exceptions. If you have I know some people who have just a strong gut feeling not to get it, and maybe because there are occasional bad reactions, maybe that's right for them. But for the most part, I'd say get one. And what I found is that the whole vaccine science has been used as just one more tool of imperialism. Now, again, I say get one. But, and also I want to say that with any vaccine company, and in general, even with the pharmaceutical industry, screwed up as it may be, as I don't even think I have to get into that one. Screwed up as it may be, the scientists at any company are 90+% honest people who are doing their best science to make a better humanity.
Yes.
It's it's at the corporate level that things get screwed up. Your average scientist is just like your average construction worker. Okay, maybe they're not building the greatest, things that exactly, a structure that exactly serves the people, but they're doing their best to be an honest worker. So same thing. Scientists are doing their best, and most of them are darn good. So with that, regardless of what you may think of a company, give the scientists some credit. They're not all in on this. It's not like they're not all in on a conspiracy. They aren't. Okay. They're doing their best. With that in particular, though, I have some major criticisms with Pfizer. Now, and I'm not going to go into the past and their history of lawsuits, which you can look up easy enough. But the Pfizer study was a mess. That's not to say that, and I'm talking about the vaccine, the peer-reviewed vaccine trial. Now, with a company that big, I would think, could be wrong, but I would think that the scientists and bioengineers who designed the vaccine are different from those who actually did the research trial. So it doesn't necessarily, so if you see a lot of flaws, as I did in the research trial, it doesn't mean that the scientists and bioengineers did a bad job. It just means that those who were, simply means that those who did the research trial could have done better research. In particular, with any, and here's actually a point I'll bring up, with there are ethics in how you conduct research. One of the main principles that you need to know is that you can't do it, you can't give anybody anything you know can harm them. Okay. Now, granted, with the vaccine safety trial, you don't know if it can be harmed, and you pull the plug real quick. If it turns out that can be the case. But what you can't do is inject somebody with a virus that you know is harmful.
Yes.
So, and where this was used politically, in a twisted way, was, if you'll recall, there was a lot of criticism when the vaccines were being developed towards China, because China was slow in getting its vaccines. The Chinese companies, Sinovac and Sinopharm, were slow in getting their vaccine trials done, despite having basically apparently the same, starting time. Where that is twisted and is very unfair criticism, and actually says good things about China, even if the Western press couldn't admit it, is because of that ethic where you can't harm someone. Remember, the way, therefore, because you can't actually give somebody a virus, what you have to do for a vaccine trial,
right,
is you have to do the vaccine trial in a place where there is community spread.
Right.
Okay, China eliminated community spread. So China had to go out, or Chinese companies. Sinopharm actually is a state-run company, whereas Sinovac is private. But the Chinese companies had to go outside China. Obviously, there's going to be a little more red tape when you go outside your country than inside, when you're in a country that has community transmission. So the fact that the Chinese companies took a little longer because they had to find other countries to do their trials that would let them, well, that's kind of good on China, not bad. But that was, I think, the first where they really, that was, I think, the first, other than the obvious things of calling it China virus and that crap, where the public not having a deep understanding of how science works was twisted around politically.
Yes.
Now, like other countries here in Asia, also did very good at controlling the community spread. For here in Thailand, because there's still some now, it's considerably less than at its peak, but they only had about 60 deaths in all of 2020. Now here in 2021, they've had about 20,000 thanks to Delta.
Right.
But also, but for half the year, they didn't have any community transmission. Same thing with Vietnam, same thing with Laos. It was only later.
I know Vietnam did a great job in Asia getting it under control.
Yes, yeah, they did it really quick. One thing I want to make a point, because I have been to Vietnam, granted only 2 times for about a week each, but I got some friends there, so I could see what was going on their social media from from my friends' posts.
Mm,
And what was really impressive is that I had friends who were sharing posts that were kind of like public service announcements. And they were saying, if you have COVID, please don't worry about, you know, your work or your finances. The state will take care of you. Please get yourself checked,
hmm
so that we can stop the spread.
Right.
Um, whereas in the US, for example, there were so many people who would avoid that for fear of what it would mean to their finances. you know,
Exactly. I mean,
whereas,
they would tell you to stay home, but I mean, who's going to pay the rent? Who's going to pay the bills? If you
yep,
have a government that's helping you with all of that to control the virus, then you can get it under control. So
bingo.
fantastic.
Yep. Yeah. Um, so that was and that's something people really just, unless you get friends in Vietnam who saw and saw posts like that, you probably wouldn't know.
Mm,
Thailand again did a great job of, containing it. From about May to about November, there was no community transmission. We still kept our masks, not on all the time. Mask mandates came later, but it was, and what got the virus back in to Thailand, at least, was that there were protests that, no, I won't get into it, but you can look this up easy enough. Um, the anti-government protests in Thailand were sponsored by the National Endowment for Democracy.
mm.
You can look that up on the NED's website. They admit it
Yeah.
flat out.
Yeah.
Um, and because of needing a greater police presence to just keep the peace, um, they had to pull military from the border. And because of all the various situations in Myanmar, which did have community transmission, that's how it got back in.
hmm
Um, so you can, I want to say indirectly, but really directly, you can blame the West for it, and the corporatocracy and their meddling for it getting back into Thailand, even if they didn't bring it back indirectly themselves, their meddling certainly was the cause of it.
hmm
Uh, so where I saw, as a teacher, one thing, because what I had done at the beginning of this year, which I'm not a teacher right now, that's another story, but having taught for the first semester of this year, and just giving a topic that I thought would be something to talk about, where people would have things to say, was I decided, okay, we're in the middle of a pandemic, let's talk about it.
Mm,
um, and this is very early on, where the vaccines were just first starting to be distributed into Thailand. I hadn't gotten one at that point. Um, but primarily most of them were Sinovac.
mm,
And Sinovac has still been the greatest contributor of vaccines to Thailand
mm.
at about 50 million. Many of which were free. You'll hear big to-dos in the press about, or at least you did here, um, about how at one point Pfizer donated, 1 million doses to Thailand. Well, at one, there's just one incident, and there could be more, where Sinovac donated 7 million. But you don't hear about that so much.
No, they never talk about it. But, that's a great point that you made, because in the Asian culture, it's a much more disciplined culture, meaning in terms of education and doing the right thing for your fellow man. While here, everyone's divided between the anti-vaxxers and those that are vaxxed. And that's why here it's still out of control, where it's past 800,000 casualties. While in Asia and the countries you mentioned, they have a respectable and disciplined culture. And I'm appreciating all the points you're making, which shows the difference in these mentalities.
Yeah. And also, when there was a mask mandate.
Hmm. Oh, I think there's a interference in the connection. Just hang tight. Hang tight. We'll get this straightened out.
Yo.
Yeah, do you hear me? There,
Okay.
your last 10 to 15 seconds cut
Yeah, I
out.
can now.
All right, yeah. Can you
Yeah, I
repeat
know.
what
There
you were
was a
saying?
little such connection lost, and again, my brain's going, okay, isn't it funny? It jumps out at this time. You know. But yeah, like I said, when there was a mask mandate, people went with it. Both the supporters of the government and those who aren't. Now they went ahead and they stuck with the rules. Now for Thailand, it was outdoor, but the idea of it being outdoor was that. I hope we're still got a connection here, bro.
I hear you perfectly.
Okay, yeah. All right,
Keep
good.
going.
I was just seeing some spin, and I was making sure. Is that, of course, you'd have it then, when you were, you'd call public indoors, If
Right.
you required it, if they required it outside, you wouldn't accidentally walk into the 7-Eleven with your mask off.
Mm-hmm.
And people are going on with that. I remember one time I was in a grocery store that was pretty crowded, and the one person who was stupid enough to do this was the one other white guy there. And I'm like, I even went to him like, 80% of your breathing through your nose, bud. But like I said, and there were even just the level of, there were, thermometer scanners, set up in pretty much in almost any store you walked into.
Mm-hmm.
Granted, that doesn't catch anybody who's asymptomatic, but it's at least something.
Yes.
Now in other places there were big like thermal scanners that actually displayed like a infrared image showing your body temperature on the monitor. That was the case at, say, some of the train stations. I know it was definitely the case at the old, oh dang, I forget the Hua Lamphong, which is now closed down because they got a nice new bigger train station. But Hua Lamphong was the old main Bangkok train depot. You walked in there, there's a big monitor, that did a thermal scan of you. Some of the chain grocery stores had those, and also little, I want to call them turnstiles, although they're actually doors, but like half size, 3-foot high doors, and they would actually, scan the cameras would actually scan your face to see if you had a mask on before damn doors opened and you got in.
Mm-hmm.
So, they took it seriously, and now at its peak, it was around 23,000 new cases a day in Thailand. Now it's down into the 3,000s. So between the vaccines and the measures, they're getting it under control.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
That's a night and day difference if you compare it to, the situation here in America, where they're still protesting that it's fake and they're feeding into the conspiracy mindset. And it just goes to show you the collapse of the system around us here, that When you have an
Yeah.
undisciplined culture and undisciplined people, it's self-evident with the advancements you showed with the Asian society compared to how they're falling apart here.
Oh yeah. And you can just go on and on that one. People have made the minute, and granted, if you were sitting out on your porch, away from everybody, the cops wouldn't give you any, wouldn't give anybody any crap. But when people started walking on the street, and there's a lot of people, casually walk on the street or even ride a scooter or whatever, they were masking up.
Mm,
Um, so it was a total night and day difference.
right.
Um, One thing though, when I was teaching, when I first at the beginning is like kind of I hate to call it an icebreaker, even though it kind of was, but it's like, okay, we're in the, I figure we're in the middle of a pandemic. Let's talk about it. You know? Um, and as I said, this was when the vaccines were just starting to roll out. Obviously, some of the Thai teachers had gotten them. I, as a foreign teacher, hadn't gotten one yet.
Mm,
Um, the students had not, but they're at much lower risk.
mm,
Um, but I had so many students complaining that the government was going with I had a lot of saying specifically that they were going with Sinovac rather than Pfizer, and I, as the teacher, had, you want to allow students to have an opinion, but it is your job when they have incorrect facts to say no.
yes,
um,
I agree.
and there were so many who were buying into the Western propaganda that the Sinovac vaccine was not effective, and that just simply was not true.
Mm,
The numbers just didn't say it. Supposedly, and I hadn't even seen the actual cases of it, um, that it did allow for, some, minor symptomatic infection, maybe a little more than the others.
mm,
Um, but in terms of keeping you alive and out of the hospital, it was doing every bit as well. There are even some samples you can look at where it was doing better
right.
in that case. For example, back in April, I think it was. I could be a little wrong on the date, but there was no, would have had to have been a little later, I think. Um,
Mm,
but there was an article there was originally in Reuters that got spread all around trying to, basically trying to diss Sinovac because it was the vaccine given to Thai medical workers early on.
mm,
Because obviously you want to get your medical workers vaccinated since they're on the front lines. And it was saying about, and it made a big to do about how, oh, maybe they're not that effective because there was out of 600,000 medical workers, there was one hospitalization and one death. So in terms of so in terms of number of what you call breakthrough cases, this was over 600,000. I think it was like 667,000. They gave an exact number. I want to say it was around 667,000. But still, that is a one. That is a better than 1 in 300,000 ratio for breakthrough cases. When
mm,
this article came out, if you looked up the breakthrough cases in the US, if you look, because it just gave a raw number, you had to go with the raw number of breakthrough cases divided into the population. It was about 1 in 30,000. So that meant this
yes, that's
sample of
correct.
Sinovac given to, and this was at the time, obviously things have probably gone up a little in both categories, but at the time that meant that the Sinovac given to the Thai medical workers was overall outperforming the collective US vaccines by a ratio of 10-1 in terms of keeping you alive and out of the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, Reuters is trying to find a way to say that, oh, maybe the vaccine's not effective.
Of course.
You know, there was another article. Yeah, and I think this was April. I think that's why I said April before, even though the Reuters one was probably a little later, like around June. And it was talking about Seychelles, which had been at that time, might still be for all I know, the most vaccinated place on the planet per capita. But Seychelles was experiencing a whole lot of breakthrough cases. And this article, it was the typical trick of, well, they got to tell the truth, but let's put some of the truth down at the bottom and count on people to only read what's at the top. Which is why I say when you read an article, always read the whole article. Just common sense, you know. Just and it was it went into.
I mean, that's one thing that's lacking here.
Yeah. Oh,
That's
yeah.
one thing, my brother, that's lacking here, and I'm glad you pointed that out, is the reading comprehension.
Yeah. Well, it's just it's not just comprehension, but they're counting on your laziness to only read half of it.
Exactly.
And what had happened is talked about how Seychelles was the most vaccinated country on the planet. But they were experiencing a lot of breakthrough cases, and it started off saying the majority were given Sinopharm.
Right.
And they sort of therefore, but we're having all these questions about whether the Chinese vaccines are effective, and they gave this like kind of just piece on this one family, that had gotten Sinopharm and was worried that because they tested positive again, it was getting their story and that sort of thing. And then you get to the bottom of the article, and it says that 57% of those who got a vaccine got Sinopharm and 42% got AstraZeneca. And that other than this one family they were interviewing, they had no data on where the breakthrough cases were. So that's,
yeah, I mean, it's all self-evident, like you pointed out.
Yeah, but you just got to read, and if you're going in, just looking at a headline, it's very easy to get a warped picture. And, you combine that with just, the bullshit of just labeling it China virus and things like that. And,
unfortunately, Brother Matt, there's been a lot of anti-Asian incidents that are happening here in the States. Recently, here in the Philadelphia area, there was a Chinese high school kid who got beat up on the train by this anti-Asian sentiment that's been going around COVID-19, and they're the ones who got it under control. And I don't know why they're suffering the racism that is coming out of all of this. So that's another red flag against the West. That number one, they can't even be disciplined to get the virus under control, and second, this hatred against. So I'm glad you pointed out all these things that you have. Please.
Yeah, and like I pointed out in number 2, I'll basically reiterate it. There was the whole to-do about the health minister of Thailand, allegedly, and go back into part 2 for more details on it. Allegedly, and I say allegedly because I don't necessarily buy it. Talking about how calling them dirty farang of course being Thai for gringo.
Yes.
And yet, like I say, go back into part 2, and you'll see that whether or not he actually said that is highly questionable, the way it was reported. But the thing is, there were no foreigners getting beat up over his remarks or his alleged remarks. So even if he had made that statement, which again I doubt, nobody used it as an excuse to go beat anybody up.
Yeah.
And we can't say that about the US.
Unfortunately, I mean that's the. I hear so many stories going on in New York and San Francisco, in Philadelphia, especially where they have Chinese communities and Chinatowns. So a lot of the Chinatowns now, what they're doing, from what I heard from one of the community leaders, Brother Matt, is they're setting up their own security teams because the police are not doing nothing about it. So a lot of the
oh yeah,
crime is getting out of control in a lot of these major cities. So a lot of these communities are taking it in their own hands, like
yep,
how it used to be back in the day with the Irish
yeah,
and Italians, like setting up their own security teams to protect their own. So now a lot of the Chinese are doing that here. And even when I went to London, I saw the same thing in London's Chinatown. They had like people posted at each corner that would watch the elderly and watch the kids because those are the two groups that get attacked the most.
yep, yep. Well, and those things go on. Um, there are some, there are some Black and Chicano communities where that is regular.
Yeah.
Um, you know, and obviously, as I think we all know, that the white power government um, likes to play the Asians off against the Blacks and the Chicano, um, oftentimes by making Asians the provisional almost white people. And although if in the Chinatowns they're having to set up their own security, um, sad as is they have to set up their own security. It certainly means that Whitey's strategy isn't working very well,
Exactly.
because then they're going to see the commonality they have, and now they're all getting screwed over.
Pretty much.
Uh, yeah. Um, but going back to the Pfizer study, um, even though Pfizer came out very high, and why I was saying, one thing I'd bring up about it, like I said, and it seems like like I said, back, because it was the biggest vaccine in the US, and with a breakthrough rate of 1 in 30,000, hey, that's still pretty good. you know, but, there were flaws in the study, mainly,
Hmm.
um, more than pretty much any other company that now Sinovac's, I'll say Sinovac's stage 3 trials, which is the bigger, um, test in the community kind of trial. Last time I looked, hadn't been published, although I'm seriously skeptical if that wasn't just Western censorship.
Hmm.
Sinopharm, which is a similar vaccine, though, had good results. But having read the peer-reviewed trials for Pfizer, for what was available for Sinovac, for Sinopharm, for AstraZeneca, and for Sputnik 5, what Pfizer did not do that every other company did that I read was test asymptomatic, test people who weren't showing symptoms.
Hmm.
Okay, so whereas all these other companies were regularly testing everybody who was a participant,
Hmm.
Pfizer wasn't, unless they showed symptoms.
Right. Right.
So what's that say about how many asymptomatic people in the trial weren't detected, that would then um, that would then skew the numbers in terms of what kind of just how effective it was or wasn't.
Hmm.
Um, Now, Astra also had a big flaw, because they did actually test people, but they did it in what was a flawed way, at least flawed thanks to the politicization of COVID, which is they had people self-test and send the results in rather than come on in and get tested.
Right.
where that was particularly troubling is that they did their study only single blind rather than double blind. To break down what that means, in a single blind study, the participants don't know which one they're getting, which is that's universal. But most of the other studies were double blind, which means the experimenter, when I say experimenter, I mean that different from researchers. The researcher is the one who actually designs the trial. The experimenter is like those who work under them, like the nurses who give the shot and that sort of thing. The experimenter, the one giving the shot, okay, in a double blind study, the experimenter giving the shot doesn't know which one they're giving. They just have a number and they report that number, so then the researchers can check whether they got the vaccine or placebo. But Astra only did it single blind, which means the person given the shot knew whether they were given a vaccine or placebo, and even though they don't tell, something like this, can they really conceal? Can they really be so good an actor that they can conceal to hide that perfectly, not give away some accidental clue to a curious participant? And let's face it, you're participating in that, you're going to be curious. You're going to be you're going to be looking for something. So by giving them the knowledge, even if they don't say it directly, and when you combine that with the politicization, that does kind of, that politicization and people sending in their own results, yeah, that's a bit flawed too. But one thing I want to point out is there have been, because for me, I had the opportunity to get Pfizer here and didn't, opted for Sinovac, which was going to be first dose Sinovac, second dose Astra. I couldn't get I ended up going back to the States briefly, as as we know, and had to, for my second, I had to get for my second dose Johnson & Johnson, which is, a similar type, it's an adenovirus vaccine, just like Astra. Yeah. I would have happily gotten a second dose of Sinovac if I could. If there's any way to get that or Sinopharm as a booster here in Thailand, that's probably what I'll do, because I had no reaction to it.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because they made a statement here not too long ago, I guess the health authorities, that you can mix boosters. Let's say if I got Moderna, I got the double vaxxed, I can get a booster from Johnson & Johnson or Pfizer. So they said that they did a study and you can mix and match. If, let's say, you're fully vaccinated from one, you can get a booster from the other. So you could probably do that.
Good. You could, let's just say you couldn't really do that before.
Exactly.
But, okay, so good. And that way, if people are a little questioning what they got, they can go for something else. So I say that's good. I think that's good. And I was a little worried about the mixing and matching at first because it was untested, but it seems to be all right. And here in Thailand, like I said, the common one was going from Sinovac to Astra, which is at least a logical progression, because you're going from a dead virus vaccine to an adenovirus vaccine. And that is a logical progression. Now they're doing a lot more Pfizer here, which I'm kind of sad at, because it does seem like they're just kind of caving into unformed public opinion, really. But I know a lot of people, but nonetheless, who opted for, because for whatever reason they were given in town, they were given out some for free, but there were certain other ones that they had allowed to be the ones private hospitals could give to people if they, were in a rush and wanted to pay, kind of thing. And that was Moderna and Sinopharm. And I do know several people who opted for Sinopharm. So,
Hmm.
uh, but you've probably heard that one place where Pfizer seemed to be, they said failing. I don't want to say failing because I wouldn't go to that point at all. But they were really criticizing the effectiveness of Pfizer in Israel. You've probably heard that. Um,
Yes, I did.
well, yeah. Well, the thing, I don't want to call it failure because the breakthrough case rate was 1 in 18,000.
Hmm.
So that's still pretty good. Okay. But when you consider that at the same time, the breakthrough rate in the US was 1 in 30,000, that
Mm.
is when you're talking about populations in the millions, that is not coincidence.
Absolutely.
Okay. If you know statistics, that is not coincidence. You don't even have to do the t-test. That'd be a t-test, that'd be chi-square. That'd be a chi-square, I think, actually. But you don't have to, if you've done the math before, you don't have to do the math on that one to know that that ain't. And what nobody's really saying though about it, is okay, who screwed up? Um, because one of the reasons why I opted not to get Pfizer is because when I had the opportunity was some coworkers were getting it, but apparently they were keeping the according to their reports, the vials of the vaccine were being left out and had been out for about an hour. And
Hmm.
you're not supposed to do it for more than two with that. Um,
Hmm.
and I even called, like, I even messaged a friend who's like the most pro-vaccine person I know, and she was like going, "Yikes!" um, and I'm not saying this was like a common thing throughout Thailand. It was just where I was that was happening, and but you got to start thinking because it was early on. They're saying that the mRNA vaccines, couldn't be out of the deep freeze. And when I say deep freeze, it's considerably, colder than your average freezer. What they were requiring couldn't be out of the deep freeze for more than a couple hours, or they'd decay and be useless. Um, then later on, Pfizer started saying, "Oh well, it's not quite like that." But there was no research shown as to how they determined that. Thank you very much. Um, And so when you see this disparity, not to mention what can go wrong in shipment, you get a 6, 10, 12, 12, 16-hour plane flight, of vaccine delivery, something goes wrong in the freezer for an hour here, an hour there, might not get caught.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
um, so when it came to the disparity, the numbers disparity with breakthrough cases in Israel, why is nobody just saying, could somebody have screwed up? Could somebody have left it out of the freezer too long? You
Well,
know?
see that's another thing, my brother, with the Western mindset, the lack of accountability. It's easier to
Yep.
blame somebody else than say, hey, I messed up, and this is what I need to do to make things right. So they don't have that here. While in the
Yeah.
East, it's an honor culture. If they mess up, they they get it right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I thank you for addressing that as well.
No, no problem. So these are just some of the questions I think that need to be asked, though, of,
Hmm.
what sort of, because just, okay, could somebody have screwed up? Is, I think, a basic question when it comes to talking about what was going on in countries like Israel,
Hmm.
where there was a high breakthrough rate with Pfizer. I know there's also been some talk. I got some messages, little back and forth chat from a friend of mine some months ago that, Singapore was having similar issues. Um, so we don't want to just say, well, wait a minute, could somebody have screwed up? And also, if, things are manufactured in such a way that they got to be handled extra carefully, you know, there can always be some human, try as people might, there can always be some human error, Whereas,
I
the other the non-mRNA vaccines, no, they still need to be handled carefully, but not quite as much.
hmm
So I definitely recommend something other than mRNA if you're outside the US. Um, on that alone, that there's just so many things that can go wrong in the
hmm
shipping. But nobody seems to want to address that. And you see these articles, and it's very clear that, well, it's a combination of two things. It's Pfizer being greedy,
hmm
and it's just um, the U.S. corporatocracy is happy to support because it gives them a way to diss China.
Exactly. I mean that's the whole thing. It's just an internal fight between these two forces that are
Yeah,
fighting for influence and control.
yeah. Um,
I
so
agree.
that's And unfortunately, though, people, real people, how's the saying go? In the war of ideas, people get killed. Um,
That's right.
so that's just some of the things I've seen. Um, and yet again, and yet I still talk to people all the time saying, "Oh, we want Pfizer." I'm like, well, hey, it's yeah, it's good. Others seem to be doing better. This is just hype. This is just hype. This is just propaganda from the company that wants it all rather than one who's just trying to share. And the thing is, though, but like I said, I'm sure the scientists at Pfizer are no different from the other scientists at any other company, just wanting to do their best to, you know, save lives.
I agree. I agree. And I thank you for joining us, Brother Matt, for this part three and how you basically laid out this exact foundation of this conversation on how Asia was successful in battling COVID-19 and some of the things that need to be highlighted, moments of clarity, reflection, and some things that need to be observed, like this lack of accountability from many of the factors that you pointed out and why that needs to be addressed. So please, any other remarks or thoughts that you have on this subject?
I'm almost done. I do want to point out there because, as you notice, there was, of course, because China discovered it. Um, there were fatalities in China, and they sealed it up, and they got. They now have one of the best. Um, the best. I don't know, best percentage of non-fatalities from COVID per capita per the population. Out of
Right.
200 some countries, they rank at about 206. Um, Thailand and Vietnam, I know, are now ranking at 131 and 132 respectively. They were much lower. Delta was what kind of messed them up. The weird thing is, I could study it really close here in Thailand. I could only um, try to get some data coming out of Vietnam, but was very strange. Um, is the way it spread. The graph. If you looked at the graph of how it spread, it was kind of like stairs, and
hmm
that's not a for Delta, and that's not really a progression you saw most places. So I'm very suspicious because I mean, basically, you had smaller countries like Thailand, like Vietnam, like Laos, um, really kicking its ass,
Right. Right.
and which when it gets down to it, that embarrassed the fuck out of the US, the UK, several other places.
I mean,
So
their entire systems crumbled with COVID-19, and it just goes
yeah,
to show you how frail everything was.
yeah. And so I can't help but wonder when I see that kind of progression that doesn't seem very natural, if there were in fact some kind of foreign agents here spreading it. That's
I
theory,
wouldn't be surprised.
you know. And like I said, Thailand's got it under control now. Vietnam's getting not fully under control. There's still some community spread, but much better. Vietnam's getting much better with it, and half of which is due to vaccine rollout. Half of it is also due to just that it's a more disciplined culture than in the West.
Yeah.
But you got to wonder if the way it happened, if there were certain foreign agents that spread it. You could definitely do it. Especially with people's ability to be reinfected. Once that can, because once it was determined that that could be done, you could very easily, like the way they were doing in Thailand, if someone tests positive, they're required to quarantine, or if they, travel from a certain area, they're required to quarantine. But if you had someone, had it and, recovered, that makes them a very easy carrier. So, then you could just selectively spread it about a bit, So I wonder about that. Like I say, if that was the case, I think it's been thwarted. But how
I mean,
how many
it would
people
make
did it take?
sense.
How many people did it take? Um, how many people were killed because of that? So.
I mean, it's not the
Uh,
first time the West has interfered in Asia in any way. So this is not.
yeah. It's also not the first time they participated in biowarfare by any stretch. I started.
Exactly.
Um, so that's pretty much it for that. Yeah, I think we can conclude here, unless you get any more things you want to pick my brain about,
No,
or vice
I
versa.
think I couldn't have said it any better myself, Brother Matt, and I thank you for joining us for part 3 and concluding this podcast on a good note and ensuring this foundation that many had about how was Asia successful in battling COVID-19. So for the audience that's listening, please take time to hear these words and thoughts with an open mind. And until next time, until Brother Matt joins us for part 4 soon down the road. Thank you.
All right, sounds good. And also, let's keep researching Africa because they're kicking its ass even better.
Exactly, exactly. We need to be open to different views, and that was the point that Brother Matt is making. That instead of just being all about you, how we have this undisciplined culture here in the West, we're not being open to other people and their
Yeah.
ideas. So see if somebody's able to do it better than you, and not be ashamed to admit if there's a better method out there and apply it
Yep.
to your own culture as well.
Yep.
So thank you, Brother Matt, and until
You're
we
welcome.
join for part 4,
All
Nur
right,
alaikum.
sounds good. You're welcome.